Welcome to Crosstalk. One more time, we're here together to study the Bible. Today we have our fourth topic, and I can't wait to tell you about it. Welcome to Crosstalk. Today we are talking about covenant. And I usually start with, a story. But today I'm going to do something completely different. I'm going to show you a personal photo. Now, this photo that you're going to see now is one of my wedding photos. I actually was getting ready for my wedding. I couldn't wait to go see my husband, and I had just put on my dress and I'm holding my rose. And while I'm doing that, the photographer goes outside and he captures my now husband doing something very unusual. He is in a corner outside the building with a little paper in his hand. And now this is the paper. Check this out. He finds him actually rehearsing his vows. See, we wrote our own vows. And I love this picture because this is my husband's hand with the vow that he just wrote, and he's rehearsing it. And it says this: "Dearest Liz, I want my vow to be part of the covenant God made with us at the cross, a covenant of grace and a covenant of faithfulness." I am very lucky because my husband shares my passion for the gospel. And so the vow that he was putting together, he said, I want my vow to be part of the vow that God did with us on the cross. This is a photo of my husband and myself after we got married that day. My husband's name is Patrick, and if we can have the photo. This is us after the little ceremony that we had that day. We've been married about 10 years now. And, I love the fact that my husband would put that. This is my vow, and it's part of the covenant God made with us. Well, by now you probably figure out that our fourth topic is covenant. We are looking at the great covenants, the great topics. We have done Goel in our first topic. How God is our kinsman redeemer, and when he made us in his image, well, he became our closest of kin, which in Hebrew is Goel, our kinsman redeemer. So he was the one that had to pay our ransom to set us free. Then we talked about paradise being an inclusio. Remember that academic word that means sandwich, that the Bible starts with the tree of life and it ends in the last chapter of the Bible in Revelation in the tree of life again, and how paradise is back at the cross, when Jesus says to the thief on the cross, well, you will be in paradise. That same word from Genesis to Revelation. We actually saw many things like the Exodus that are from Genesis all the way to Revelation, because actually God had told Abraham in Genesis about the Exodus. Well, today we go back to Genesis with Abraham. And God makes a covenant. You see, when humankind fell, and it went with the kidnapper, as we said. Well, God made a covenant. And as we said in our first program, God told the devil, I'm going to crush your head. Remember Genesis 3:15? You're not getting away with my children. Well, this covenant is repeated over and over again throughout the Bible until in the New Testament we realize that Jesus is the blood of that covenant that would ratify the covenant that God made with humanity. The main people in this covenant are Adam, who get the covenant. Then Noah gets the covenant again. Then we have Abraham, Moses, David, and Jesus. So the six large names on the covenant are those that I just told you. Of course, we have many times that the covenant is repeated in between. That is Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, David, and Jesus. So today we're going to go to the covenant God made with Abraham. So let's go to Genesis chapter 12. Now, this is a very interesting covenant because Abraham doesn't live in Israel. We don't have yet a nation of Israel. We don't have any of the things that we'll have later in the Bible. So here in Genesis chapter 12, Abraham is told that he will have a great nation as descendants. Now, Abraham at this time doesn't have any child, but he is promised that he will have a descendants. You know, it's interesting because when I married my husband, not only he made a covenant with me, but my husband already had 3 grown-up daughters. So I became a grandmother immediately after we got married. 2 weeks later, I became a grandmother. Now I'm a grandmother of 4, expecting the 5th grandchild through my husband's daughters. And here we have Abraham being told that he will be a great nation. Chapter 12 of Genesis, verse 2, I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great. And so you shall be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you. And look what it says at the end of verse 3. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. See, this covenant was greater than anyone had imagined because God was starting with the people of God. So here, we're going to call this the covenant, okay? So God gives Abraham a covenant. Now, this is where the covenant is ratified. Chapter 15 of Genesis. God takes him out and says, okay, look outside at the heavens and at the stars. Chapter 15, verse 5. And he took him outside and said, look towards the heavens and count the stars, if you're able to count them. And he said to him, so shall your descendants be. Verse 6 is the first great verse that we have on righteousness by faith. Okay? It says here that he believed him and it was accounted to him as righteousness. In the moment that he believed God. Because see, he believed him out of nothing because he didn't have a child. So he's believing just the promise of God, looking at the stars. So he's holding this covenant. At the end of this chapter, it says here, verse 18, on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham. Okay, very good. So now we have a covenant, and you know, Abraham is walking around all these years with this covenant that he will have a child, and the child eventually will turn into a great nation. Isn't it so much easier when you are looking things later, when you already know the end from the beginning? But see, all of our lives are like that. We don't know the end from the beginning. And so Abraham holds a covenant, and 1 year goes by, 2 years go by, and he's getting a little nervous because it looks like God forgot the covenant that he has made with him. And as the chapters go by, you see this anxiety that starts building because it's not happening. Oh, I have to tell you, I usually don't have great problems with the will of God, but I have great problems with God's timing. And so here we have Abraham, and look how chapter 17 of Genesis starts. When Abraham was 99 years old, he's still holding a covenant. He doesn't have anything other than the covenant. And he's 99 years old, and he's talking to God, and God keeps talking about this everlasting covenant. And so Abraham says, okay, maybe it's my servant. Well, you know he gets impatient. You know the story of Hagar. Look at verse 19 of chapter 17. God said, no, Sarah, your wife, will bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant. Okay, now we got it. The covenant that he's holding is going to be through his son Isaac, a son of Sarah. Okay, we got it all straight. Isaac is about to be born, and we get it again. We understand. Look at chapter 21 of Genesis. Verse 12. God said to Abraham, do not be distressed because of the lad and your maid, talking about Ishmael. Whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her. For through Isaac your descendants shall be named. Okay, very good. We have Isaac. He was born. We're ready to go. The great nation. And then Genesis 22 comes along. Now, we don't understand this until we understand how long Abraham has waited, how specific the covenant is that God has made with him. I mean, no wonder they call him the father of faith. We'll see more. But so he's going, and everything looks great, and Isaac is growing, and then Genesis 22 comes along. Now, Genesis 22, for the reader of the Bible, we are told ahead of time that this is a test and only a test. You know those systems that we get sometimes on TV and on the radio? This is a test and only a test. But Abraham doesn't know that. He doesn't know this is a test. Chapter 22, verse 1. It came about after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. Now, check this out. How specific verse 2 is. He said, take your son. Okay, well, he has two. Maybe it's Ishmael, right? No. Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac. Is there any doubt about who this son is? Now, everybody that I have ever heard preaching on this chapter talks about the terrible test of killing a child. Of course, that would be a terrible test. I can't even think of it. Why would it be to be told by God that you have to kill your child? But the test here is even greater than that. Is to kill the son of the promise, the one through whom God has already said that he'll have a great nation. Now, you're probably wondering what this is. Well, here we have a cross and we have a little lamb. Now, I don't want to get ahead and tell you why this lamb is here, but I'll tell you in a moment. Now, here we have now Abraham having to hold the covenant on one side and the knife on the other. I mean, how do you go up Moriah this way? This is the son of the promise, through whom descendants will come and great nations. God says, offer your son. And not only offer him, look what it says, verse 2. He said, take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering. Now, let me remind you that burnt offering was the only offering that would completely burn the victim. There was nothing left from a burnt offering. And here he's told that the son of the promise, the one that has the covenant, he should offer as a burnt offering. Now, this is such a passionate narrative, one of the most incredible narratives that we have. And so this is the particular command of God. Take your son, go and offer. Those are the three verbs. Go, take, and offer. Now, Abraham is going up this mountain with these two realities. Have you ever been in two realities and you don't know which one to believe? God said, you will be saved through Jesus Christ. But you look at yourself and you know you deserve death. And you go in your life with these two realities. So here we have Abraham, verse 4. On the third day, Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance. And he told the young men that went with him. And I don't know if this is a moment of faith that he's having, where the covenant is prevailing. Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad. And in the Hebrew language is, we will go, we will worship, and we will come back. It's the first person plural. Like we're going to do something up there. But on the other hand, he's taking fire, and he's taking a knife. He's taking the wood. He knows he's supposed to sacrifice his son. Verse 6, Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac, his son. And he took his hand, the fire and the knife. So the two of them walked together. Isaac spoke to Abraham, his father, and said, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. And he said, hey, here's the fire. Here's the wood. Where is the lamb? This is where this story starts getting very important for us to understand our salvation. Abraham has a covenant from God. You know, Hebrews tells us in chapter 11, if you want to read it later, that Abraham went a step farther than Job. Remember Job, when he got all his trials, he said, God giveth, God taketh away, blessed be the name of the Lord. Well, Abraham came to believe that if God gave it and God took it away, he would give it back, says Hebrews, because he came to believe that he would be raised from the dead if he had to kill him, because this was the son of the promise. So at some point, Abraham came to believe God said it was Isaac. I don't understand God's command, but I'm going to do what he says. And if he's going to be dead, then he'll resurrect him from the dead, because he said Isaac. This is the trial that he's going up, because God is about to teach him something. Verse 8, Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering. Of course, he didn't know how true that would be at that moment. God is teaching him something on top of that mountain. Let's continue. And it says here, verse 9, then they came to the place of which God had told him. Abraham built the altar. Look how deliberate all the actions are. He put the wood there. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. In the moment that Abraham stretches out his hand, because he's going to go through it with it, even though he doesn't understand it, and he's holding the covenant in the other hand. And so Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife. At that moment, the angel of the Lord said, Abraham, Abraham, stop. Now, it's very important to understand what happens here, because this is the first story of its kind in all the Bible. Verse 12, he said, do not stretch out your hand against the lad. And then verse 13, Abraham raised his eyes, and what did he see? Well, he looked, and behold, behind him there was a ram caught in the thickets by his thorns. Okay, so this is going to be the ram for now. And look what he does. Remember the 3 verbs that God told him? Go, take, and offer? Well, they are here. He ended up doing exactly what God told him, but not with his son, but with a replacement of his son. So let's read it. Verse 13, then Abraham raised his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in the thickets by his thorns. And Abraham went and took an offer, the burnt offering, in place of his son. Genesis 22 has the first substitutionary statement that we have in all of the Bible, where a little animal is killed instead of, in place of, substitutionary death, in place of his son. Jesus would say much later in Mark 10:45 that he came to give his life a ransom for many. It was in the place of many people that he would die. Actually, he would die in the place of all people. Unfortunately, not all would take his sacrifice in their place. So Abraham, verse 14, called the name of the place, the Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it will be provided. Now, this is where it gets really, really interesting. Mount Moriah is the first encounter we have with this substitutionary death. When Abraham is going up the mountain with the covenant of Isaac, he would be a great nation, with the knife that God told him to kill him. In the moment he's about to kill him, the angel stops his hand. This is on Mount Moriah. He finds a ram. He offers a ram instead of his son. He kills the ram, and he does the 3 things that God had asked him. He went and took and offered instead of Isaac. Now, the Bible is wonderfully clever in how it develops meaning as the stories go. Now, we don't have time to tell you that many years later, David is facing a big problem in his kingdom, because all these people are dying because of a sin he had. It was a census. It was an issue of pride. We don't have time to talk about it. But God said, well, you can go and buy a particular land. Is a little piece of land that this man, this Jebusite, owns. You have to buy specifically that land and sacrifice there. When you sacrifice there, then the pestilence will stop and nobody else will die. So he buys this little threshold of a Jebusite and sacrifices there, and the pestilence stops. Now you're going to say, what does that have to do with anything? Well, check this out. Bear with me for a moment. On Mount Moriah, God stops the hand of David on Mount Moriah. Later on in the life of David, God stops the pestilence in a little land owned by a Jebusite. Okay, now is when I have to take you to one of the most amazing verses in the whole Bible. 2 Chronicles chapter 3, verse 1. We are now in the time of Solomon. Solomon has to buy and decide where he's going to build the temple of the Lord, where the sacrificial system that continuously reminds them that there's a little lamb that is going to die instead of the sins of the people happens. And look at this. Check this out. Don't miss it. 2 Chronicles chapter 3, verse 1. Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. Go to your Bible and check it out. It's amazing. It's really amazing. Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David at the place that David had prepared on the threshing floor of the Jebusites. See, all these places were the same place, the same geographical area. Mount Moriah, then the place of the Jebusite that David bought, because as you remember, Jerusalem was the city of the Jebusites that David conquered and made it his capital. So all the place is the same place. And in that place will be the temple. And of course, that's the mountain where Jesus would die later. All of these places that Jesus is teaching, that there is a covenant, and that he has made a covenant, that he will fulfill the covenant and ratify it with blood. Now Abraham gets a glimpse of what God is going to do. And you know how I know that Abraham on top of that mountain gets a glimpse of what God is going to do through Jesus Christ on that mountain? It's because Jesus said so. Now I'm going to take you to the Gospel of John. One day, Jesus is talking to some Jews. And they said, well, we are sons of Abraham. Chapter 8. This is what he said to them. Verse 56. Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad. Oh, I'm sure he was glad, because I am absolutely sure that he understood the day of Jesus Christ on top of that mountain, the day that his hand was stopped and the ram was there and the ram died instead of his son. Can you imagine how glad he was to understand that all of this was a symbol of the blood of the covenant, which was Christ? Now, I know that sometimes we go through life like this. Not only about our salvation, which is the primary paradox of we have the covenant of faith, but then we see the reality of death. And then you have to go up that mountain of life, figuring out, are you going to believe the covenant of faith? But in other things, because in many things there are two realities, the one that is perceived by faith and the one that our eyes see. You know, the Bible teaches us that God made this covenant from the very beginning. There is a covenantal phrase in the Bible. I will be their God and they shall be my people. Now you see this covenantal phrase constantly. This is like a vow of a bridegroom to a bride. I'm going to be your groom. You're going to be my bride. Well, of course, this is the language of the whole Bible. When God says, I have made a covenant with you and I am coming back for you. I already paid your dowry. See, I already paid what you were worth, which was my blood. Now I'm coming back for you to take you home. Exactly in the style of a Jewish bridegroom that would come back and take the bride home. And look at Revelation 21. We find one more time that covenantal formula. I will be their God and they shall be my people. Revelation 21. Let's start on verse 1. I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth have passed away. And there is no longer any sea. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready as a bride, adorned for her husband. Oh, I adorned myself for my husband, and he had a vow for me. Unconditional love. Verse 3. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the tabernacle of God is among men, and he will dwell among them, and they shall be his people, and he will be their God. Finally reunited in this vow. But it was a very high cost, because his blood was instead of, remember that substitutionary statement? The truth is, God has made a covenant with us. He has made a great covenant. And I invite you to believe his covenant. So let's open the covenant that God has made with the human race. And I'm going to read from Hebrews chapter 10, starting on verse 12. Hebrews chapter 10, starting on verse 12. And we're going to put it on the screen for you so that you can read along. Ready? He, having offered one sacrifice for sins, for all time, sat down at the right hand of God, waiting from that time onward until his enemies be made a footstool for his feet. For by one offering he has perfected for all time those who are sanctified. And the Holy Spirit also testifies to us. For after saying, this is the covenant that I will make with them after those days, says the Lord, I will put my laws upon their hearts, and on their minds I will write them. He then says, and their sins and their lawless deeds I will remember no more. Now where there is forgiveness of these things, there is no longer any offering for sin. Oh no, this was it. This was the one sacrifice for all time, for all sins of all people. And he died instead of us who deserved death. This is the covenant. Now, I want to invite you to accept Jesus Christ as your personal Savior. And if you have been in the church for a long, long time, and you still do not live with the assurance of your salvation, let me take you back to Mount Moriah. This is where God started to show, in the same geographical area that eventually the temple would be on, and that the cross would be on, because that's the whole Mount Zion eventually, that this was the plan of God, that he would give his son instead of, in place of humanity. This is the covenant. And you know what? You can only accept it by faith, really, because we all have a knife in our hands when we see ourselves, but we hold on to the covenant of God by faith, exactly like Abraham did in Genesis 15:6. He believed, and it was accounted to him as righteousness because he believed. So I invite you to accept Jesus Christ as a personal Savior. Ask him into your life today. And if you have been a religious and a Christian person for a long time and you don't have the assurance of salvation, I invite you to know today that this is true. After all, faith is assurance of things not seen, the certainty of things hoped for. That's how you accept it. This is Crosstalk, where we talk about Christ and him crucified. And please join us again next week for another Bible study from Genesis to Revelation.